Hi, everyone, and welcome to Prep's new conversation series, Demystifying How to Launch a Successful Career Through Conversations with Interesting People Working Across Industries. I'm your host, Meg McQuillan, and today on Prepped, how to navigate launching your career after graduation, especially if you don't know exactly what you want to do or how to go about finding that first role. Today, we're talking to Paul Van Winsen, friend of Prepped and currently overseeing partnerships for Amazon's international expansion team, where he builds ways for Amazon's businesses to grow through third-party partners and explores go-to-market opportunities for new country launches. Prior to Amazon, Paul spent 7 years at AdParlor, leading teams through growth, internal restructures, and ultimately a successful acquisition. But before all this, Paul was a biochem turned economics major at Queen's University, and like a ton of soon-to-be graduates, he didn't know exactly what he wanted to do or how to go about finding the right first job. But he knew one thing: he needed to find something, and relatively quickly. Hey, Paul, thanks for being our very first guest. I'd love if you could start by taking us through what's going through your mind in the lead up to graduation. What do you think your future holds at this point? Are you applying to jobs? Maybe just take us back to that moment to start things off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Meg, and great to be here with you. So like you mentioned, I was a Queen student who moved from biochemistry into economics and transitioned in a sense that I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do coming out of school. I just knew what I didn't want to do, which was biochemistry. So when I moved into economics, and got closer to graduation, I really started leaning towards the marketing and technology aspects of business and where I thought I wanted to be. But given my background and lack of internship history, I really struggled to get job opportunities with some of the larger companies. A lot of my friends who were focused in marketing were applying to the large CPG organizations, the Procter and Gamble's, the Johnson and Johnsons of the world. And I was really struggling to get noticed. So obviously I was starting to get a little nervous. All these things were running through my head. So an approach that I tried was to transition to a little bit more of a focus on smaller companies and try to look into the burgeoning tech startup space, which is obviously something that a lot of people are aware of now, but was much smaller and harder to find 10 years ago when I was looking at things. So that was a little bit of my approach and where I was at the time.
Got it. And so when you say you shifted your focus from kind of large companies to smaller companies, how did you find out about smaller companies? As you mentioned, this is 2011, 2012. Things looked pretty different at this point. What did that kind of job search look like at the time for you?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of a struggle. It was fewer and farther between. I started reading about the space on news outlets, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, but a lot of the news at the time was predominantly writing about the space in the U.S. rather than in Canada. However, I was lucky enough to find a few job openings on university job boards. So the majority of what had been posted at the time, was the larger company space, but startups, looking for talent, looking for interns, had started to post on university job boards. So that was where I initially started my search and where I was able to meet and get introduced to the first startup that I would intern with and work with, and then ultimately become a co-founder of.
Got it. So walk me through maybe as you're starting to, read, get smart on the space, figure out, albeit, you might be reading about it in the US, trying to figure out and put together the pieces in Canada. How are you positioning yourself? How are you getting in touch with these companies? Are you just responding to job postings? And then when you get in front of them, how are you talking about yourself? What are you selling them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing that was harder for me coming out of school is because I didn't have a large job history or large internship history, I didn't have existing professional experience that I could point to that would really showcase my capabilities and my ability to help that particular company. So what I tried to do is I tried to find other elements of my experience and background and history that wasn't just professional experience that I could point to that would showcase certain principles that might really help the company out, or certain attributes. So for example, I put a lot of focus on sports growing up, as evidenced by my Toronto Maple Leafs hat that I'm wearing today. Was very focused on, yeah, exactly, big game. But anyways, I was very focused on team sports. I spent a lot of time whitewater kayaking growing up, and I really pointed to a lot of the attributes I was able to gain through sports, from leadership and ownership, being a captain of a variety of teams, to perseverance and dedication, the amount of work that came in to be successful, to really learning and curiosity. So I pointed to, the number of books that I read, or articles that I'd read on a certain space or topic. And I really used that to showcase that, hey, I may not be coming in with as much professional experience as other candidates, but I have these attributes, whether it's from tenacity to curiosity, that can really benefit your business moving forward. So I really tried to draw on those to help position myself.
Got it. So maybe walk us through, what is the first, so you mentioned you joined a small startup, so you get through the kind of interview phase. What were the interviews like? Was it one? Was it multiple? And then talk about what company it was that you joined and ultimately co-founded.
Yeah, so it was a couple of interviews, but it was all with the same person. So my co-founder, who I'd met, who was in Toronto, just graduated from U of T at the time, was looking to start a contest marketing startup. This was 10 years ago at the time. The hypothesis was we saw a lot of big brands and CPG companies in particular running a lot of contests as a marketing strategy. We didn't see a lot of small to medium-sized businesses doing it, at least on digital. Facebook wasn't really prevalent on mobile, and actually had banned running contests on your wall at the time. Twitter wasn't as prevalent in Canada quite yet. So we saw this as a gap in the marketplace, or my co-founder did. He did not have a product in circulation. This was a pre-product startup. He had a PowerPoint slide deck that he was pitching to investors, and was really looking for somebody to help him get this product off the ground once it was live and once it was built. So somebody to own, marketing and business development and initial sales for the product. And he was looking for a series of interns because he didn't have any funding yet to pay individuals. So that's I was able to find this posting on the Queen's job board. I did 2 interviews with the other co-founder, both of which were at a Starbucks on King and Yonge Street in Toronto. And he took me through the pitch deck and the idea, and thought it was an interesting opportunity. So I agreed to start working with him first as an unpaid intern, and then bring on as a paid employee once we were able to raise some family and friend funding and launch the product, and then eventually became considered a co-founder of the company.
And based on those initial, I'm imagining you've just graduated, you're taking these meetings at a Starbucks. Does it all feel very grown up? Do you feel like this is a sure thing? It's going to go, it's going to work? Or how are you feeling at the point of accepting joining the company?
Yeah, I think because at the time, I was reading all of these articles about predominantly US-based startups, and getting into it, you obviously only read about the successful ones. So I assumed this was going to be a slam dunk. I was going to be a multimillionaire right out of college, and this was going to be the most successful thing, and I was going to be able to retire after this if I wanted to. I was very, very convinced at the time. Didn't quite end up working out that way, but I did end up learning a lot along the way.
Yeah, you were going to be laughing that everybody else had joined these big companies and you had this huge success joining a much smaller company. But I do think this hits on something really valuable for especially young people graduating, where you feel like the really traditional opportunities, huge, rotation programs, leadership development programs that really big employers offer, super attractive. But to your point, when you've identified that maybe you have a bit of a different profile, it's hard to get noticed. Smaller companies are an amazing opportunity to kind of get your foot in the door and learn a lot very, very quickly, because your role becomes quite big by comparison. So maybe walk us through what that first year was like, and kind of what you learned. What was your day-to-day?
Yeah, so my day-to-day was different every day, but I would say the primary responsibility that I had was, like I said, marketing, sales, and partnerships once the product launches. So really, how do we get initial businesses to adopt our contest marketing software? So basically, our software at the time was an embeddable widget that, as a small business owner, you could put on your website with one line of code, and it had a Reddit-style upvote, downvote contest software. So really, I was responsible for small business sales. I did that predominantly in Toronto, where I would, hand out flyers. I would go introduce myself and hand out one-sheeters to small businesses, whether it was restaurants to laundromats to coffee shops to small grocers that I would walk around and hand out flyers as a bit of a word of mouth strategy. I also hired a team of 18 part-time interns across Ontario to do the same in Toronto, as well as in some other predominantly university towns across Ontario. Have them hand out flyers, have them try to get small businesses to adopt our software, and then also that team was focused on, when we would launch contests, helping to drive adoption of those various contests. We knew that the success of our product depended on how usable these contests were going to be, and we didn't necessarily know what the marketing capabilities were going to be of each small business that used our software. So we tried to help them along by driving adoption of the contests ourselves through predominantly guerrilla marketing. So that was my initial focus areas. On top of that, we were also trying to raise a seed funding round in the early days, which I was heavily involved with along with my co-founder. That ended up falling through despite a number of investor meetings, but again, learned a lot throughout the process.
So you're doing like guerrilla marketing, small business sales, you've hired 18 people at this point. Like, what did you know about any of those things coming into the role, and what skills do you think were the most important that you were able to kind of flex or build in that first role?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely none of that was anything that I'd ever done before. So it was a lot of learning, a lot of making mistakes. I think the biggest one, for me, was understanding that you weren't going to do everything right the first time. And really the most important thing was to, if you were going to make mistakes, make them quickly and learn from them. And the second one is, as a startup co-founder, a very early employee of a startup, you have to have thick skin to an extent. Things aren't going to work the first time. My dreams of, I was just going to join this company and we were going to take off and become the next billion-dollar startup were very quickly shattered. And I had to come to grips that success is never a straight line up and to the right, and everything's difficult, and you really need to work for everything you get. So learning to be said no to by a lot of small businesses when we were during the sales process was a tough thing from an ego standpoint to wrap my head around. Understanding that you were gonna work with individuals, and because they were part-time beyond paid interns, some of them were really engaged, and I still have a really great relationship to this day, 10 years later. Some not so engaged and didn't end up working out as well. But yeah, just kind of learning to persevere. I think if you talk to a lot of successful entrepreneurs across the board, the one trait that they share the most often is that they just didn't quit and when things got difficult. So that's one of the most important things I would point to.
Yeah, that's a great learning. And I think for everyone, whether you go into entrepreneurship or not, the job hunt is so much about learning how to handle rejection, because it's going to happen so many times. And it's such a valuable lesson to say, you know what, somebody didn't say yes to me, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't keep trying. And that doesn't mean I don't just pick myself up and try another angle or try with a different tactic. So I think that's really important. So we fast forward. You're with this company for about a year, if I'm recalling correctly. And then when does it start to become evident that you're like, okay, I need to find my next role? And what are you thinking about, 1 year out from graduation? What are you thinking about in terms of how to make the leap and how to approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. So after about a year, my co-founder and I, we'd both been doing it full time. And we realized that we are kind of in a bit of a vicious cycle in the sense that neither of us were a technical co-founder, so that was the first mistake that we made. We were able to raise some family and friends funding, outsource development to a dev firm, but we got into this vicious cycle where we were able to land a few small business customers, be able to get a little bit of revenue in the door. The hope was that that revenue would then be able to pay the development firm to build the next set of features, which would allow us to land the next set of customers. And the wheel just wasn't really working. As I mentioned, we tried to raise some seed funding that fell through at the last minute. So after about a year, we just decided that, well, we like this idea. We've both been living in Toronto for a year on no salary and struggling a little bit personally. So although we learned a lot, we decided to hang it up. So I started looking for other jobs. But to your point, it was difficult. I had worked for one company that had 2 employees that nobody had ever heard of, so I really didn't have anything on my resume that was more to stand on prior to my second set of job applications. So honestly, I took a bit of a volume approach, which I would say there are pros and cons to. But over a 2-month period, I spent 8 hours a day focused on the job search. So it was definitely something that was intensive for myself. I probably applied for 250 jobs over that time period. And I tried to customize just about everything. So I tried to adjust my resume. I tried to write a custom cover letter. I tried to write custom emails or LinkedIn direct messages or Twitter direct messages or whoever I could find to contact the hiring managers. But it wasn't easy. I mean, I wasn't a resume that would naturally stand out to recruiters because I had no, traditional experience that anybody had ever heard of. So it was something where I was, again, really trying to sell. Even though I'd worked for a failed startup, I had this high level of ownership. I was willing to try to learn really quickly. I was willing to try to do a lot of things that are sort of outside of the traditional box of experience. But it was also something that was a lot of work. And, similar to my startup experience, had a lot of rejection very early on. So just didn't hear back from a lot of roles. Got a lot of negative responses back. So had to learn a second time through to deal with those issues.
Yeah, the job hunt never fails to be more challenging than you think it's going to be. Or, I mean, not always. I'm sure you can talk about your latest move, and I think knowing more people is certainly helpful. But I do think this kind of awareness of the volume approach is definitely an approach. To your point, applying for at least 200 jobs and doing that work to tailor each application is critical. But also, when you think about when you're applying for large companies, with applicant tracking systems, we know that about 80% of resumes get screened out by a machine before a human set of eyes ever really take a look at it. So how do you get your first in, and how do you kind of move to the next role?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of getting your first in, I think there's a couple things. One is go in understanding that it's going to take a lot of work. Go in understanding that you're not going to necessarily submit one resume for one job and you're going to get that one on your first time through. I mean, you very well could, but I would say that's the exception, not the rule. So you need to go in with an expectation and to not get demoralized and not quit your search if things don't work out the first time around. The second one, the thing that really worked for me is try to make it personal. One thing that's great now is there are so many more tools available online to individuals and to job searchers than there were 10 years ago when I started. So this is something that I would encourage everybody on the call to take advantage as much as possible with all the tools that are available for customizing things like your resumes, for customizing your approaches, for you can do so much more research on the company that you're applying for, the role that you're applying for, and really try to personalize what you're putting together. Whether that was like I did back in the day, personalizing your resume and cover letter, writing personal messages on LinkedIn to the hiring managers or to some of the individuals working at the company. Actually coming up with suggestions for the business or the role that you're applying for is something that I've seen really benefit really positively later in my career as well as a hiring manager. Those are things that I've really taken into account. So as much customization, as much personalization as you can put in is definitely helpful. And yeah, just don't quit.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, demonstrating that you know something about the company. There's so much opportunity to do that research and to come in with kind of, you're not going to have all the inside knowledge that, whoever's interviewing you is going to have, but certainly come in with a perspective and demonstrate that you've done the critical thinking and the research to be like, I have some recommendations right off the bat. I've used your product, or, I've seen the clients that you've signed. So I think that's all really good feedback. So given that we're at about 20 minutes, we're going to pop over to the questions, seeing so many good ones come in. But maybe just before we do that, Paul, if you could go back now, I think in your last transition, the most recent one to Amazon was actually a referral. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So that's obviously dream way to go into a new role. That's so ideal. But if you're thinking about what you've learned about building a successful career, about figuring out, from a very non-linear starting point, like it doesn't necessarily all add up, but when you look back, you're like, oh, it all makes sense. What advice would you give young Paul, going back to when you were graduating, about launching your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things. The first one is, like you mentioned, I did get my latest role, through a referral and through my personal network. And really, when you're building that up, I would say the most important thing is to create more value than you capture. So don't go into a new relationship, immediately coming in and asking for things. Try to figure out how you can create value for the individuals that you're interacting with, even if that's, hey, I saw an interesting article. Hey, I'd like to introduce you to somebody else I know in my network that could be a really valuable resource for you. But always be thinking about how you can create value. And I've found, throughout my career, that building a few really strong, really long-lasting relationships that you're consistently touching base with and consistently checking in on is more important than meeting 100 people at a conference that you might have a loose connection to. I find that the depth and the value creation that you're able to build associated with individual relationships has been, the strongest thing that's benefited my career over time. And then the second thing is I'll repeat what I've said a couple times throughout, which is just don't give up. Success is never, whatever the success means to you, is never something that's a straight line up and to the right, and is going to come easily. So it's something that, really sticking to it and persevering, and realizing, where you are right now is not necessarily where you're going to end up. So always keeping that frame of mind. I know that's easy to say and much harder to do, especially when you're going through difficulties. But I think it's really important to always remember.
That's an amazing last note to leave on. Kind of, where you start is not where you end up. Keep at it. Put your head down. Develop relationships and make sure you are, nurturing them, because ultimately that's going to be what makes the difference at the end of the day. So thank you so much. We're going to go into questions. So I'm seeing a bunch pop up here. I have a question here from Sean. I've been attempting to bolster my resume due to a lack of tangible experience. I've been looking into certifications for a broader employable skill set, for example, an ECBA for a business analyst or CPB for bookkeeping. Are certifications worth it to stand out? I heard they can be hit or miss and may not be worth the financial and time commitment.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do think it really depends on the field that you're getting into. I would say that fields that are very specialized either require or you can gain a lot of benefit out of certification. So the broadest example of that would be, I couldn't apply being an economics grad to be a doctor, right? You need more specifics, you need more higher level education for that. The same with being a lawyer, and it kind of goes on. It goes on down. So if you're in a really specialized field, Sean, there's definitely specific use cases where that additional education and those additional certifications will really be a benefit for you. That's not something that I personally have, and I find that at least I'm heavily biased towards starting your career in startups and in that type of environment, because I find you build up a generalized skill set very quickly. You have to wear a lot of different hats, and you end up, building a skill set that can benefit you throughout your career. So it does really depend on the field that you're looking into. I would say, for just my personal take, is that the more general the field, maybe the less necessary those types of additional certifications are in terms of the benefit you're getting for the trade-off. But the more specialized your field is, the more useful to required they become.
And I might just add on to that. I think those are all amazing points. I might also just add on, like, reach out to people that are working in the careers that you aspire to and ask them, like, just straight up be like, hey, I'm thinking about certifications to help me stand out. From your perspective, is this something that's going to be a value add to an employer if I'm trying to get hired? For example, if you were looking to hire someone at the entry level and they had this versus didn't have it, does that sway your opinion? I think honestly, just going right to the source and asking can be really powerful. So we'll move into a second question here from Janani. As a recent graduate, I often hear that the only way to land a job is through referrals and networking. Does that mean that online job applications is not a thing at all, and we should shift our job hunt focus to reach out to more referrals and networking rather than spending time on online job applications?
So, I think this ties to, a lot of what we've gone through throughout the presentation. I'm somebody who did get my first few roles through online job applications. That's certainly not the only way. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like, I wouldn't recommend doing just one or just the other. I would recommend both. I would recommend, looking out, reaching out, applying for jobs, also reaching out to try to network to individuals, meet them at conferences. It's not a mutually exclusive one or the other approach. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I do think it definitely, makes sense to continue to apply for roles online, and I've still done that in the recent past of my career. And I don't think, although it is hard for some roles, I would say generally also the larger the company, the harder it sometimes is through cold applications to get through. But if you're looking at smaller companies, if you're looking at just for myself being in advertising and technology, in the technology startup space, there are a lot of opportunities that you still can get through, and that will hire most of their roles through external facing applicants. So it does depend a little bit on the role, but they're definitely not mutually exclusive. I think I would pursue multiple strategies as you're looking for what is my first step in my career.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Lejla asks, do you have suggestions on how to excel in a business role and receive a greater position in a company?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things that you could do. I think it goes back to the first one is the piece of networking advice. One is always try to create more value than your capture. So always try to be as helpful as possible. Where I've seen people be successful is, especially when they're early on, try to ask as many questions as possible. Try to learn as much as you can. When I started my first role at AdParlor, I'm sorry about that. When I started my first role at AdParlor, I would write down lists of questions. I knew my manager was a very busy individual, but I would write down lists of questions. When I got 30 minutes with him, I would badger him with 100 different questions. So try to learn as quickly as you can. Try to get up to speed as quickly as you can. Try to figure out how you can add value to individuals. But I always found that degree of learning and trying to get up to speed as quickly as possible was one of the best pieces of advice for people I've seen, be really successful in a lot of different roles, especially early on and when you're coming in at the entry level.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think this whole theme of like being resourceful to make it as easy for your manager as possible to get you up to speed is an amazing piece of advice. And I love that around creating more value than you take from any relationships. So that's awesome. Let's try one more with our last 50 seconds. As fresh graduates, a major barrier is lack of work experience, especially for international students. Do you suggest working at a small startup first and then eventually move to a larger company? What mindset should one have while networking with recruiters?
Yeah, so two things. One, although I will admit and state up front that I am quite biased, I definitely do advocate for the startup approach. I think both in terms of getting your foot in the door and getting some experience, it's sometimes an easier path forward for new grads than trying to move into a large company right away, which can be quite competitive. And two, your learning curve at a startup, because you're forced to wear so many different hats in such a short period of time, is very high. I found in my first 2 years at Ad Parlor, which was the company I ended up joining a couple years after graduation, my learning curve in the first 2 years was like something I'd never experienced before, and really prepared me for a variety of different role types in the go forward. So I find that's something that's that I would highly advocate for if you're coming out of school. But again, it's not a mutually exclusive approach. I wouldn't just do one or the other. Just focus on startups or bigger companies. I'd try to focus on casting as wide of a net as you can.
It's amazing. Well, Paul, I know we're keeping you a minute over. Thank you so much to everyone on the line for all the great questions. If we didn't get to your questions, we will try to get to them and post them along with the webinar in the logged in state of Prepped and also YouTube. And you will also all receive a recording of this webinar. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. What a great first guest, and have a wonderful rest of your Monday, everyone.